got me through today, because we have to talk about some historical revisionism that's going on right now that makes other historical revisionisms pale. I wanted to talk about all the good things that, the White House has gotten done in the last, 3 months? I mean, they're arming Ukraine for freedom. The first black woman has been appointed a Supreme Court justice. COVID deaths are down 75%. They have another wave of free home tests. And as someone whose family has just gone through COVID, it was so great to be able to get these free tests. Really easy to get them. The weekly job losses are the lowest in 50 years. The unemployment rate went down to 3.6%. And none of it seems to matter. The obituaries are all being written for the Democrats this fall. The Republicans' platform is rich people have had it rough for way too long, and Donald Trump, and critical race theory bad. So I want to talk about all the things going on right now, but I want to instead bring us to the past and show how current events aren't always current, and show how things that happened hundreds of years ago are still impacting us today, and how things that happened hundreds of years ago are still being used to sucker white people. The poor white, or the middle-class white working conservatives, who intellectually are always being sent to the back of the bus. Today is the anniversary of the 3/5 Compromise, which declared black people less than human, so they wouldn't count fully for the census, which is something that apparently now modern conservatives think was a really good thing. It happened in 1783, the first instance of black slaves in the USA being counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose, of taxation. That was in a resolution for the Congress of the Confederation, and of course, it was later adopted in the 1787 Constitution. The 3/5 Compromise said that enslaved humans were considered 3/5 of a person, so it would boost the population mainly in southern states, which tended to have smaller populations. Otherwise, they would have had even fewer members of the House of Representatives. And one of the most contentious, ugly issues at our Constitutional Convention was on the state's population, because the population determined how much representation they would have in Congress. And we still fight about this today between gerrymandering and redlining. But back in the 1780s, the sparsely populated states were terrified that the northern states will have way too much power in our federal legislature. And this whole fight led to the Connecticut Compromise. It led to the design of Congress, where seats in the House of Representatives are given out relative to population size, and each state will have 2 seats in the Senate. But the southern states, well, they were terrified that the northern states, which had bigger populations, would just run roughshod over them in the legislative process. And they whined about it. And eventually, the North didn't want the South to take their ball and go home. So they all came up, North and South alike, with a murderous, disgusting, hideous scheme in which southern states could count their human property for the purpose of having greater representation in the House. And the compromise, again, allowed these states to count 3/5 of their slaves for the purposes of population size, meaning representation in Congress. Keep in mind, these slaves, they weren't allowed to vote. The slaves had no representation in Congress. They weren't even called slaves. The Constitution referred to them as other persons. This is the anniversary of the compromise that gave power to slaveholders by giving them greater political representation for people they considered less than human. It never mentioned black people. It just says 3/5 of the total number will be counted, to whom are Indians and other purposes. It's very evil. It was built to give the slave states more political influence than they had relative to their voting population. The political power of the North would have run roughshod over it, right? I mean, that's what they're scared of now. This is the Electoral College argument. There's more of us than there are of them. If you ever look at the news and wonder how is it possible that 77% of Americans support abortion rights in all or some cases, and yet abortion rights are on the ropes. Most of us think the rich should be taxed more. Why doesn't that happen? most of us think that gay marriage is fine. Why is there still a controversy about it? Well, this compromise allowed the South, namely people who owned humans, to dominate our federal government and to dominate our presidency. And it led to what we call the Slaveholding Republic. They called it slave power or slaveocracy. And that refers to the political power in the U.S. federal government that was held by slave owners in the 1840s and 1850s, prior to the Civil War. It was a big political buzzword that I wish we still used. Frederick Douglass and other anti-slavery activists, they used this term to decry what they saw as the disproportionate power wielded by these wealthy Southerners who owned people. And the argument was this small group of rich white people who owned other humans, this minority had too much power. This minority of powerful human-owning white humans had seized political control of their own states, and they were trying to take over the federal government of the entire country illegitimately, mainly because they wanted to expand their own power, which means they wanted to protect slavery. Again, the 3/5 clause got this whole ball rolling. It counted 100 slaves as 60 people for seats in the House, and therefore for electoral votes. It gave the South, I'm going to say this again, it gave the South disproportionate representation on the national level. Now, the South had less than a third of the free population, and they had less than a third of the wealth. But of the first 16 presidents, 11 were from the South. 17 justices of the Supreme Court out of the first 28. 14 attorneys general out of the first 19. 61 presidents of the Senate out of 77. 21 speakers of the House of Representatives out of 33. 84 foreign ministers out of 134. You see where I'm going at this? The South had more power than they had people. The slaveocracy was a term Frederick Douglass used, and Horace Greeley used it, and John Quincy Adams used it, and Abraham Lincoln used the concept, but not the term. But it was widely used by the Republican Party. And again, this is important, the Republican Party was formed in 1854 to oppose the expansion of slavery, which brings us to today, and the historical revisionism about slavery, or as I call it, uncritical of racist theory. We've heard this a lot with the Civil War, right? All the arguments right-wingers use to justify or put a soft coating on the barbaric rape, murder, and mutilation of humans that was slavery. Well, it was states' rights. The war was for states' rights. That's the crown jewel in their kingdom of bullshit, states' rights. Or it was the war of northern aggression. Or, well, Lincoln was a Republican and Booth was a Democrat. So the Democrats have always been the real racists. Or, well, the Confederate flag is heritage, not hate. Well, now, believe it or not, they're actually making a claim that the 3/5 compromise was originally written into the Constitution as one of the better ideas the framers had. And where does it come from? The Daily Wire. Yeah, Ben Shapiro's little nest of doughy mediocrity and vipers. I want you to hear Daily Wire CEO, co-CEO, Jeremy Buring, as he hails the 3/5 compromise as one of the better kinds of concepts the founders came up with. This is a clip of 5 white guys, including Jeremy, and a couple of guys I know, Ben, who I've tangled with, and Michael Knowles, who I've tangled with. Here's the clip. This is from this weekend. This is 5 white guys sitting around drinking and smoking cigarettes, talking about how great the 3/5 compromise was, because really, it helped the slaves. Listen to this.
I mean, Jon Stewart has been on this, he just recently discovered critical race theory, and so he's on this white guilt tour, and he on his show, which I didn't even know existed until last week.
That's what they do.
He was talking about how the American dream it doesn't exist for black people, and his proof of this was the 3/5 compromise. Like we have not improved since then.
And not only that, but he's wrong about the 3/5 compromise.
Right.
The 3/5 compromise is one of the better kind of concepts that the founders came up with.
Here we go.
To long-term in slavery in America. They didn't say a black person is 3/5 of a human. They said,
done to end slavery.
It doesn't make sense. Slave owners in the South, that you're going to count your unrepresented, unable to vote, and unable to function in everyday life slave population in your census for the purpose of representation in the Congress, maybe you can't count them. And the South, particularly South Carolina, essentially said they wouldn't join the Union if they didn't get to count them. And so the compromise was they don't get to count all the way so that you don't get to use
your enslaved population,
an enslaved population to gain votes.
But that's an important point. It's true, but it's also like we should just be able to respond. Well, that makes no difference right now. That has no bearing on modern America. But
it is against this argument, the whatever it is, 1619 thing, that America's DNA is racist because your DNA makes you more yourself, and we have gotten less and less and less.
But the 1619 Project, it's being taught in schools. It's being taught in schools all around the country, and I actually think this is why we're focused on the education issue.
Okay, what you just heard was a gaggle of privileged white conservative males talking about how the Three-Fifths Compromise was a good thing, how benevolent the slavers were with the Three-Fifths Compromise. And it pretty much ends with this whole talking point of, well, we can't be racist now because we're not as racist as we used to be. I mean, they're pushing the argument now, and this is all over conservative media and conservative social media, that the Three-Fifths Compromise would help to end slavery. It ended slavery, folks. It only took the Three-Fifths Compromise, plus 80 more years of slavery, working people to death and raping them and mutilating them and selling their relatives off, and then a full-scale civil war. This was written in 1787, okay? Slavery didn't end until 1865, thanks to the non-slave states, which elected an anti-slavery liberal Republican, and the slave states seceded, and they lost the goddamn war. The northern states had abolished slavery by 1804. The Three-Fifths Clause had nothing to do with it. The slavery apologists will come up with new excuses every year, and they'll call white empathy white guilt. See, using the enslaved population to gain votes is exactly what happened. Okay, in spite of what Mr. Boring was saying there, the Three-Fifths Compromise did not long-term help end slavery here in the U.S. It was just a way of hitting the snooze alarm for another 7 decades before it took a fucking war to end slavery. And by the way, who was it a compromise for? The slaves? How exactly did people in bondage benefit from this compromise? Well, it was only another 80 years. I mean, that was it. That was acceptable. And you'll hear this all the time. They'll say, oh, well, slavery would have ended eventually, which is their way of saying more years of humans being raped and mutilated and worked to death is acceptable to them. This is revisionist history. Oh, yeah. The Three-Fifths Compromise. That's what killed slavery. Otherwise, my God, thank God, we would have had to go to war to get rid of it. Dennis Prager pushes this all the time as well. The slaves weren't the ones getting 3/5 representation. The slaves had zero representation, no matter what the compromise was. It was the Southern white people, the powerful, wealthy Southern whites, who had representation under this compromise. The powerful, wealthy Southern whites who sent the poor, hardworking Southern whites to go fight their battles for them. Because don't forget, if you owned more than 20 pieces of humans in the Civil War, you got the 20 slave exemption. And to this day, you'll see it. Millionaires at birth. Millionaires at birth. Like Bush and Romney and Trump, who send out the hard-working suckers of white America to fight their battles for them. No. The slaves did not benefit from the compromise. They were property. And this was Congress getting rigged by their masters. The Three-Fifths Compromise enhanced slavery. It kept slavery going longer, and it cemented the power of slaveholders in our government. There was never any chance that slaves were going to be counted fully. It wasn't designed to free enslaved people at all. It didn't help free enslaved people. The war did that. It was designed to maintain power. And by the way, the white Southerners that those assholes are praising, they would never have gone for it if they thought it would end slavery. It didn't end slavery. It gave them a stranglehold on government in this country at the federal level through 1860. And then several 100,000 Americans had to die to end it. And that's what it was about. The slave owners got to get a few decades more profit from barbaric ownership of humans, while also pretending that, we have the moral high ground. We don't really like this. So I thought of this because I saw an article at the Iowa Starting Line, which is a political site, that said why more students are walking out at Iowa schools. And it turns out, in light of all these recent bills in the Iowa legislature, like vouchers for private schools or restricting what teachers are allowed to say in class, a lot of students in Iowa are getting fed up and they're walking out. In Johnston, Iowa, last Friday, a group of 100 students walked out of class and they stood on school grounds. These are high school kids talking about these bills and how these bills that are being passed on the state level are impacting teachers and students in Iowa, and how they're forcing teachers to self-censor. And that's what it's all about. That's what banning critical race theory, which isn't even taught, is about. That's what the Don't Say Gay bill is about. It's not about banning anything. It's about terrifying teachers. And students have been walking out of public and private high schools in Ames, West Des Moines, all organized by student groups. They've held walkouts in Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, and Waterloo. And they're calling out House File 2577, which requires teachers to post every single piece of classroom material online, and House File 802. And that's a state law you're going to hear a lot more about that prohibits so-called divisive concepts from being taught in school. It's essentially an educational gag order. One student said a history lesson she had about the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution left most of the class confused because the teacher was never quite able to explain why it existed. This law prohibited teachers from teaching divisive concepts. And it targets ideas like teaching systemic racism or sexism or homophobia, things that shaped the country, things that shape how we're interacting now. So where are kids going to learn about it? Right-wing media? The Daily Wire? The 3/5 compromise was a compromise the North made with the South so they wouldn't abandon the Union. And these people right now are bending over backwards to justify and whitewash torture and rape and dehumanization and oppression. Okay, it wasn't anti-slavery if slavery existed for another 80 years. It was designed to cement the power of slave states so slavery couldn't be abolished. It was leverage to get another 80 plus years of slavery. And then the Civil War was leverage to get the 13th Amendment passed, and the 14th and 15th too. You're going to hear a lot more about this, and it's the newest in their revisionist history. So never let your right-wing loved one or coworker or douchebag friend on Facebook tell you the 3/5 compromise was anything more than a concession to stop southern states from using their entire population to inflate their numbers. If you'd had enslaved people count as 0, not 3/5 towards representation, that would have ended slavery sooner, because it would have taken power away from the slave owners. That's the irony of it. If you'd counted the enslaved humans as 0, that would have helped them more. 3/5 allowed it to be perpetuated. Remember, guys, the only thing that would have been anti-slavery at the time of our Constitution would have been ending slavery. We're at 866-997-GRIT. Let me get a quick call before our first break. Bill in Pennsylvania.
How are you doing there, John? It's nice
sir.
to hear your voice there.
How are you? How are you?
I'm doing well. You mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt's statement about fear.
I did.
And, of course, fear is meant to control people. That's what
You're
fear
right.
is. The great Franklin D. Roosevelt said, well, all we have to fear is fear itself. And well done. Your soliloquy there was well done there.
Well, thank you.
I really enjoyed it there. And there's 3 real religions.